My name is Yvonne Lobby, and I'm with the Poughkeepsie Public Library District. And thank you for joining us this evening for our artist talk with Mary Flad. Mary is an artist who's and writer who has made her home for 50 years here in Poughkeepsie. As a visual artist, she has worked primarily in the design and making of woven tapestry. Her inspiration is drawn from her surroundings, as the work is shown in the exhibit at the Boardman Road Library branch demonstrates. The exhibit is titled "The Garden, the Landscape, and the Weather." Mary has made tapestries for a number of public buildings, churches, private residences. These include the Institute for Ecosystem Studies in Millbrook, the Orange Regional Medical Center in Middletown, the Unitarian-Universalist Fellowship in Poughkeepsie, and Hudson River Housing's Fallkill Commons apartment complex. During the 2017 exhibition of the 17th century Barberini tapestries at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City, Mary served as a demonstrating artist in residence. Mary continues an active involvement in the local cultural scene and is a regular participant in Poughkeepsie's Arts and Community Action Network, established by the Arts Mid-Hudson organization more than a decade ago. So Mary's work is actually on display at the Boardman Road Branch Library through May 3rd. And with that, I'd like to hand the mic over to Mary.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. It's great to be here. I've tried to get my thoughts organized for this because I know a lot of the people who are watching me know me in other contexts, and I have to try to establish some rationale for all of this. So this will be my attempt to cover 50 years in 25 minutes, and we'll see how that works. And then I will look forward to your comments and questions after that. Yvonne, if you could put up the PowerPoint, we've got a bunch of pictures for me to talk to, so we'll start with that. So let's go right to the first one after this title. So let me give you a brief summary of how I got to where I am today. I did not go to art school. My learning about the textile arts and tapestry weaving in particular has come from a number of sources. It's happened over a long period of time, and there have been a lot of periods when I have been totally preoccupied with other things than design and making of textiles. But we'll try to cover this in some organized fashion. I have some notes so that I don't get completely lost in what I want to be talking about. Let's switch to the next slide, Yvonne. I was in the Peace Corps in Thailand in the mid-1960s and spent most of my time teaching English and working with a Thai co-worker to train elementary school English teachers in an area where there were not many people who had actually heard English spoken before. We traveled to a lot of villages throughout the Northeast on the back of her motor scooter. And I found myself in the midst of a culture where textiles were the highest art form and prized possessions. And I collected a lot of pieces from the various villages that we visited. These pieces here are all cotton ikat, weft ikat pieces that were woven to be used as sarongs or passins. And they're good examples of what I found to be a very enthralling part of the life and culture in an area that was very remote from high civilization. Let's have the next picture, Yvonne. This is the previous pieces were all made of local cotton. This was made of silk, also woven in a village by somebody who specialized in the weaving of what was called old woman cloth and was thought to be very ugly, but very prized. It was again ikat, where the threads were dyed in a pattern before they were woven and then woven into place. So out of this experience, I got very intrigued with learning more about where textiles came from and what this whole area of cultural artifacts was all about. That took me a long time over the next few years, and I'd like to jump forward to 2017 when I had the chance to be one of the demonstrating artists at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, when they had an exhibit of the Barberini tapestries that were made in the 17th century in Italy, and that have been in the possession of the cathedral since the late 19th century. These were wall-sized pieces made to decorate a palace or castle, and they cover a whole variety of biblical themes, maps of the Holy Land and the Middle East, a lot of different things with the extremely complex design that was devoted to these kind of pieces. They were the tapestries of the medieval and Renaissance period were woven not by individual artists, but a design was made by an artist, and then a crew of weavers would work on a piece, sometimes for years at a time, to complete it. So it gave me a new respect for something that I had been learning and practicing in a different context than this. So let me jump now to some of the works that I did over a period of time and say a little bit more about how I came into tapestry weaving. So let's go to the next image. This is one of the early pieces that I did in the 1980s, 1981. It was called Sunny Window, and it's a piece that's still in my possession. And I learned about a lot of approaches to textile design from being part of the Syracuse Weavers Guild in the early 1970s, and then meeting the person, Margaretta Grandin Nettles, who was the demonstrator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art when the unicorn tapestries were on exhibit there in the mid-1970s. She became a friend and mentor to me, and I studied with her off and on over the years in the 1970s and learned a lot about modern Scandinavian approaches to design. She was from Sweden originally, had moved to the United States, taught in New York City, and then in Massachusetts. And she had a great influence on me. And so a lot of my ideas about tapestry come out of the experience of knowing her and learning techniques from her. Let's move to the next piece, which is a different technique than traditional tapestry. This is a translucent linen piece, very large. It's about 7 feet across and 30 inches high. And this was woven in the late 1970s. And then the next one, please. And this is a smaller piece, definitely traditional tapestry technique, also woven in the late 70s, drawing on my own designs developed from my travels in Asia on the way home from Peace Corps years earlier. Let's have the next one. As my own designs developed, I got more and more interested in, particularly in plant forms and botanical themes, and in themes that related to the landscape and and gardens. And that's much of what is in the exhibit at Boardman Road now. This piece, Lavender, is in a private collection locally. And the design of it was drawn from the books, in the early history of book publishing, called the Herbals, Herbals, books about plants and their medicinal properties. And lavender and a number of other plants are illustrated in some of those, and I've drawn on them as I've developed my own designs for textiles. The next one, please. So the next several are pieces that illustrate my interest in the garden theme, which is one of the themes in the show at the Boardman Road. This is Paradise is a walled garden, is a very small piece, under a foot square, and it was made about 8 or 10 years ago and is in a private collection locally. And the next one, and this is a considerably larger piece, Espalier With Seven Pears. Both of these pieces are drawn on the idea of walled gardens, and there's some great examples of this garden form in our local area. The Belfield estate up at the FDR has a lovely walled garden, the Beatrice Ferran garden, and the Claremont estate also has a beautiful walled garden. This particular design, the Espalier With Seven Pears, was drawn from drawings I did visiting the Biltmore estate in Asheville, North Carolina, which has an enormous walled garden. And the walled spaces tended to be used for very contrived plant forms. Trees would be pruned and grow right against a wall and become a perfect design inspiration. Let's have the next one, please. And this is a little looser approach to the herbal designs. This is called The Beets Go On, and it was drawn both from the idea of a contrived plant space and also from an overload of root crops from the Poughkeepsie Farm Project. And then next one, please. And this piece, Spring Garden, which is in the show at the Boardman Road Library, was drawn from the first blooms in the front yard some years ago. Now, I'd like to talk about some of the landscape themes that I've dealt with. This tapestry was done also about 1980 for a church in the Adirondacks where my parents and grandparents had a long-term attachment. It was drawn from the hills surrounding the North Creek area at a time when the church was being renovated. This is a building from the 1870s, I believe, and a number of families involved in the congregation played some part in design of different things that were to replace the traditional elements of the interior. It's about 8 feet in length and I think 30 inches wide, and the design comes not just from the mountains around and the trees in the area, but also this is in the area of the Barton Garnet mine, and the garnet rocks were part of my design as well as part of other elements that were installed in the church at the time of this renovation. This piece, Bluestem Meadow, was done for the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies when their new building was built in about 1985. And it was commissioned for the reception area there. The meadows around the building at that point had a lot of a grass that was called Little Bluestem, which had a bluish cast to it. And it was from that that I tried to start to develop an abstract design, but reflecting the beautiful surround of the Institute. I understand that there's going to be some major changes to their building environment in the next few years, and I'm interested to see what comes next, particularly in the plants as well as the buildings itself. One of the things that they've been noted for in recent years has been a lot of Lyme research relating to the ticks in the area. I don't think that that will change very much, but I'm sure other things will. Let's look at the next piece. When I had the chance to do a piece for the new building at the Orange Regional Medical Center in Middletown several years ago, I became acquainted with the black dirt agricultural area just beyond Middletown, and went and took a lot of photographs and drawings and did this small piece to work out an approach to design using the black dirt farm area. This small piece became just a kind of a practice for the moving on to the larger work for the commission for the hospital, which is the next piece. So these three panels are each about 30 inches square. So the total width of this on the wall, it's in the reception area of the Cancer Treatment Center at the Orange Regional Medical Center. So it reaches about 96 inches across on the wall. It was great to be able to integrate the changes of color of the different seasons into the plans for this, and to work it out. Each of the panels was done separately, and then they're hung together. The next piece I'd like to show you is another landscape of the river. Actually, we live not far from the edge of the river, and throughout the time that we've been in the Poughkeepsie area, we've been within a mile or two of the river. And this was commissioned by an acquaintance who was retiring and moving away from the area, and asked if I would do something for her. So Blue River with Bridges was done, experimenting with the various approaches to sky and water. I know I have a number of friends who are photographers in the area, and I know that the challenges of capturing all of the wonderful different surfaces in the water and in the sky overhead is great for photographers, and I get to play with it in a different way. And the using yarn and trying to catch the sense of the wind and the clouds and the changes in the tide on the river is a delight and a challenge. The last theme of the three that in the show at Boardman is the weather. And I hope I don't have too much of an opportunity to look at more weather this weekend, but the things that I've been trying to capture visually as I've thought about climate changes have included the rain and wind and snow and melt and flood, and it's easy to talk about things, but sometimes very difficult to capture them. I've done a couple experiments with things that would represent wind, but it's a little difficult to do. I've been trying to figure out a way to deal with things like tsunami in a visual fashion. But this piece, Spring Rain, is one that's in the show at the Boardman. And the next piece also, Farm, Field, and Flood, is one that was done, I guess, 3 years ago when we had so much flooding in the Midwest. And I flew out to St. Louis to see family members and flew over that area, which was like an ocean, the extent of the Mississippi on either side of the river. And it's been very interesting to see that these things that we talk about also have such a visual impact that can reinforce our concern. The other piece that's at the Boardman that I wish you'd take a look at if you get there is there's one called Glacial Melt, which looks at the disappearance of the glaciers in so many areas of our country and around the world. So before we get to question time, I'd like to have, there's a short video that Yvonne will play so that you can see something of how these pieces are put together and what the loom consists of and the materials they're working on. This is about 6 minutes in length, and then I'll look forward to your questions and comments. So Yvonne, can we run with that? See. The Fallkill Commons project is in the final stages of construction, and when it's opening in the next couple months, it will provide housing for close to 80 units, some of them for people who need some supportive services and others for people who are in the area and looking for modest cost housing. And because it's located along the stream that is the old industrial water source for the city of Poughkeepsie area, it offers the challenge of getting people aware of this body of water, originally a natural stream, now almost completely bordered by stone walls for flood protection that were built in the 1930s. And the waterfall of the stream, the main waterfall, is very close to where the stream enters the Hudson River. And that is the subject of the tapestry that I'm working on, capturing the seasonal colors of the trees or fields has been something that I have found particularly intriguing. And that's certainly true with this as well, because there is a large part of the tapestry, which is the area of the waterfall itself, but there's also an area across much of the top of it that captures the foliage of the trees and shrubs and weeds around the stream. And so pulling together all these elements into a design that would interpret for people looking at it the combined natural beauty and the built environment around it is an interesting challenge. Also offers me the chance to work with the color palette of the composition. And as is always true with a natural setting, the colors change from season to season. So it's very enjoyable playing with the elements that can be interpreted in this tapestry. And building a design is not that of simply creating a photographic image, but rather taking an idea and interpreting it in a way that the eye of the beholder will grasp what it is that you're doing. And I find this to be particularly interesting if we're talking about sky or water, because you're dealing with the not just the natural colors, but how the viewer will understand what it is that you're capturing. Having to interpret to somebody who's new to the whole idea of woven art is a very interesting part of what's happening with this. So. My studio is only part of the work environment of creating a piece, because I'm usually working initially outdoors to make sketches, perhaps with a camera, perhaps with a pencil or pen and ink, and that can happen when I'm sitting on a train or walking in the woods. But then once I'm ready to start working on the piece, I move into the studio setting, and I have to deal with the location of the loom on which the piece is going to be woven, and the winding the warp on which it will be woven, and setting up the loom so that it's ready to go. In addition, I need to have a sketch done in the proportion and the actual size that the piece will ultimately be, so that I can use that sketch, which is called a cartoon, to keep track of where I am in the weaving of the piece as it disappears around the beam as I go through the length of it. The lengthwise threads, the warp, have been measured out on a board, and now I'm stringing them onto the loom and threading them through the heddles and through the beater so that they're all placed in an orderly fashion, and this will become the basis on which the piece will be woven. The tapestry will be hung in one of the community rooms in the Fallkill Commons project in the city of Poughkeepsie, which will be completed by mid-2020 and occupied by then. So it's exciting to be part of it. The tapestry itself will be about 25 inches high by 60 inches wide when it's hung on the wall, and it will be in an indoor space, hung flat against a wall. So if I could just add a couple comments about the video. This was done by Melissa Gagliardi, who's a young filmmaker who was living in Kingston. I think she's now living in Dobbs Ferry, and has done interviews with a number of artists in the area and filmed them. So it was great to have this chance to work with her and try to get this message into a short enough piece that people could get a sense of it. One thing I do want to say is that the very large loom that I was working on for that is one tool that can be used for tapestry weaving, but it's equally true that tapestry can be woven on a much smaller instrument like this one right here, that's just a wooden frame. So there's a lot of different scales at which this can be done. Obviously, the Barberini tapestries were done on a very large structure, but that isn't the only way that a tapestry can be approached. So I hope that that makes some sense with, I've tried to cover a whole lot of things in a lot of different directions, but I'd be happy to hear any comments or questions that people have at this point.
Okay.
And I think, Yvonne, you may have some in the chat also.
They're all praise, Mary, in the chat. And I will send this to you after the recording's done, but you're welcome to unmute yourselves if you'd like to ask Mary any questions.
I would. Mary, I'd like you to talk a little bit about your process. You sketch in pencil or pen and ink. How does the color come in?
Well, sometimes it comes by way of the camera, and sometimes I do a color sketch with watercolor or gouache. I'm not anybody who claims to be a painter, but I do use paint to work out a plan for things. And the other thing that enters into the planning is what yarn is in my stash. So the combination of colors and weights of things plays a part in developing the design. Traditionally, you would work with very consistent weight of yarn, but contemporary weavers may depart from that in many different directions. And I have done both, tried to work with very consistent materials and also work with varied weights. I should say that I work on a linen warp. Linen is very firm and acts as kind of the canvas for this. But the color areas, which are almost entirely in the weft, the crosswise threads, are almost entirely of wool. I may use some linen or other accents, but almost entirely of wool. And that's primarily because wool yarns have such a wonderful range of color available in them. So there used to be a number of Scandinavian lines of tapestry yarn that were imported to this country. That's less readily available now, but there are also some new lines emerging in this country and in the British Isles. And the other fascinating thing that's happening is that there's a group called the American Tapestry Alliance, which is the kind of membership group, which has exploded in membership. It's a totally international group. There's very large, very exciting things happening in tapestry design and weaving in Australia. There's a lot happening in Eastern Europe. There are very different approaches to design that are evolving rapidly, and largely because of this great exchange of information, a lot of it coming out of Zoom. There's a lot of cross-fertilization going on around the world. So it's been quite interesting to see that just in the recent years. And what's happened in groups like American Tapestry Alliance and another textile group I belong to is that they've about doubled in membership in the last 2 years because of this channel of communication that we now have. That answered a lot more than Susan wanted me to.
Oh no, that was great, Mary.
So one question you got, Mary, was which I think you answered somewhat in your last response, was what type of thread you use, which you did say wool. And then another person asked, Kirsten asked, how you deal with colors, and do you ever change your mind? And if you do you have to rip out the threads?
You do not change your mind once you put it in. That's why, it is such a slow process that if you were of the mind that you had to go back and correct things, you would lose your mind. So it is something that you have to, have a process of moving forward with, rather than changing your mind. And I think I mentioned this at one point. You have to put a lot of time into the planning of the project too, because you've got to think out the color range that you are going to work with, and the supply that you're going to need and to achieve it. And I mentioned making a cartoon so that you have a way of keeping track of things, because as you're doing the design on a large loom, the finished work is disappearing around the beam. So you have to have a way of keeping track of where you are in your plan to know that you're not losing it in terms of what you intended the final product to be.
Okay. All right, so we have one question in the chat, and then I will get to Anne, who raised her hand. Joel said at the library in the exhibit, there's a tall piece that's quite open. Can you talk
Yes.
about how that is made and how it differs from
Yeah.
your other tapestry weavings?
Right. That is, I referred when we showed that the picture of the kitchen window piece. It's a translucent linen hanging, and that piece that Joel's referring to is called Crimson Trellis. And again, that is mainly linen. Some of the bright colored areas are of wool, but it is very open. It's almost like mosquito netting in its text, in its openness, although the linen thread is firmer than that. And it was a technique that I learned again from Margareta Grandin Nettles, the Swedish weaver that I mentioned before. And it was inspired by a visit to friends of ours in England who had the kind of things that you can see in English gardens, and hardly ever aside from that, where you had roses climbing all the way up the house, roses in bloom all the way up to the second floor. And the piece doesn't look exactly like that, but that was the inspiration of it. So I'm glad Joel mentioned before that he loved that piece. I was so delighted with it, because it was fun to work on, but you have to have a particular kind of mind to appreciate it. Joel's is definitely that. Thank you.
Anne, you're welcome to ask your question. If you're muted, you can.
Mary, your tapestries are just so gorgeous. And you capture the natural world so beautifully. And I'm thinking about the weaving of the Hudson River that you did for your friend, and the sun and the sky and the light was so beautiful. So can you tell us a little bit about your evolution, the struggles you might have encountered as you have developed your craft?
Well, frequently an idea that you work out and weave and finish and hang on the wall does not meet your expectations. So there are pieces that, and particularly I mentioned that in relation to water and sky, because those are such interesting and challenging things. We think of the sky as blue, but the sky is rarely blue. It's usually got a lot of other things in it beside blue, and getting that sense of texture into it is it's a lot of fun to play with. And that is certainly true with the water, the watching the river. It's just amazing. I mean, you're so aware, if you go down to the river regularly, that this is a tidal body of water, because sometimes the water is going down and sometimes it's going up, and you got a lot of differences in the light and the texture coming out of that. And the goal is not to create a photograph. It's to play with the things that you're seeing, and that's the part of the interesting thing to work with. There are a lot of contemporary tapestry weavers who do super realistic work, really create things that almost could be photographs. But there are a lot of other things to do also, and I'm certainly more of the playing with the possibilities than the trying to create a photograph.
And we have Robbie Stevens. You're welcome to ask your question.
Hey, Mary, it's
Hi,
Leka.
how are you?
Hi. Hey, before you got to Thailand, what were you studying in college? Did you study art at all?
I thought when I went to college that I would be an art major, and the first semester I took art courses and decided I would be bored to tears if I spent 4 years in the studio. So I became an English major, and that entitled me to do whatever I really wanted in terms of reading and exploring other things besides art. So I didn't stick with the studio approach, but then after college, I spent some time in graduate school in anthropology. And that certainly is one of the things that drove me into the interest in material culture and textiles. And I decided I wasn't interested in an academic career, so I didn't complete a graduate degree in it, but it certainly enriched my interest in cultural diversity around the world. And it had another, I think, positive impact in the long run, in that I have a son who's an anthropologist. So that's
And Paul, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Mary. Andy and I are just, how are you?
good.
Andy and I are just so amazed at this work. It's absolutely beautiful. And it's funny you mentioned the English. I was thinking I had just finished the book Circe, and the loom plays such a prominent role in that book as a character. I was wondering, have you ever done, or do you get inspiration from stories that you've read, or mythology, or other things other than the sort of the real world right around you?
Sometimes from words. I mean, not necessarily from stories, but sometimes from lines of poetry. I've done pieces inspired by lines of poetry. The several pieces that I've done for religious buildings have been inspired by a line from scripture. And yes, words play a part in it. But it's not generally the whole story, but just a particular concept. I mean, the Penelope thing, of course, gets into everybody's mind about what weaving is all about, but I haven't really tried to deal with an elaborate story. And in addition to that kind of thing, I mean, other than words, the other thing that I have been playing with and did one small piece on is I'm very interested in petroglyphs, the stone carvings, in caves and on rock surfaces around the world. And I think, over time, I may spend some time doing some designs coming out of that.
Okay, I have in the chat, Barbara Todd asks how you go about striking the right balance in the eye of the viewer between the texture of your weaving against the imagery, which might have widely varying textures.
Right. And it varies. It's sometimes, and to some degree, that's dictated by the materials at hand. you know, that first piece that I showed, a sunny window, that was right at the beginning of my doing larger tapestries, and the yarn in that piece is all rug weight yarn, which is unusually heavy to use for a tapestry, but it lent itself, because of the color range I had in that supply, it lent itself perfectly to that design. I don't know if you can see behind me, but hanging over the the screen behind me is a flat weave rug that's done in tapestry technique and in tapestry design. And again, the weight of it creates a different texture to it. It would work fine to hang on the wall as a tapestry, but it would be considerably heavier than a typical tapestry would be. So a lot of it has to do with how much variation do you want to integrate into a piece, and a lot has to do with what's available.
Mhm. Well, Robbie's raised his hand again, or their hand again.
Oh, it's me this time.
Yep,
I
sure.
wanted to say that the tapestry behind you glimmers. It literally glimmers.
Mhm.
That's all.
Well, yeah, it's that's partly, you know, that David came over to help me deal with the light challenges of Zoom. And it may just be, but I thank you. I appreciate that. There's somebody else yesterday said that they love what they were seeing in it too. So
It comes across the screen. I don't think it's the light. I think it's the tapestry.
okay. Thanks, Alexa.
And then Anne mentions in the chat, she says, you mentioned the International Group of Weavers. You said that many exciting ideas are coming out of the group. Could you give us some examples?
Yeah, I had seen before I knew about this Australian tapestry workshop that I just have become aware of in the last year. I've been up to visit my son and gone to an exhibit at the museum at Harvard of Australian Aboriginal art. And that is an amazingly rich visual culture. And what's happened in Australia it must be about the last 30 or 40 years, is that tapestry has become the main public art form. And large tapestries are being done for public buildings, every place, for opera houses, municipal buildings and so forth. And a lot of the designs are coming out of that tradition, that visual art tradition, which is a world away from us. Just beautiful, beautiful stuff. And that certainly has something to do, in addition to the fact that one thing that Australia has a lot of is sheep. And the fact that you've got a great resource that can be woven into tapestries is a big help in encouraging that art form. So I don't know too much of the specifics of how this explosion of activity in tapestry in Australia has come about, but it's really exciting to see.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question. So I see the skeins of yarn or the strings laid out behind you, and they're in beautiful different colors. Do you do any of your own dyeing? Have you experimented with that?
I have experimented with it a little bit, but it's messy and it smells. You have to have access to an outdoor space to deal with some of the hanging to dry and so forth. And if I had, you know, the inclination, I might get into it, but I did dye things at one point, but I have a great enough range of resources that I'm unlikely to get back into that again.
Mhm.
A lot of tapestry weavers do much of their own dyeing, because that way they have a great deal of control on the range of colors that they're dealing with.
Thank you.
If anybody would like to volunteer, I'd be happy to talk to them.
Is there anybody else have any questions? You're welcome to raise your hand real quick. Okay. Well, thank you, Mary. Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us.
And
Again.
Yvonne, I think you
Oh,
have.
yes, I have a slide. I have a slide.
Yeah, I want you to put the.
Okay, so here.
Oh, yes.
That's how I feel. Here's Mary's exhibit at the Boardman Road Branch
Beautiful.
Library. It
I
is
shall go.
beautiful. It's on view through May 3rd, and the library is open every day but Sunday. So you're welcome to go and check it out, see it in person.
Beautiful.
Pictures don't do it justice for sure. Oh, I see another comment. Let me look. Oh, they enjoyed listening to you speak. So I will follow up with an email to everybody who registered, including Mary's contact information and you know, the details again about the show and a link to this YouTube video.
Yes.
So I hope everybody has a great evening, and thank you again, Mary. Your work is fantastic. It's an honor to have your show exhibited.
Yvonne, it's just been great being here.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Seeing
Thank you.
faces from all over. Thank you, everybody, who showed up,
Yes, yes,
including
thank you.
Yolanda.
Yes,
Thank
thank you very
Mary.
much.
Bravo.
Thank you.